A park ranger sat alone at a picnic table in the heart of the Montana wilderness, his lunch barely touched, his thoughts somewhere far darker. Then, a noise, a rustle, and a shadow appeared. What looked like a bold little thief trying to steal his sandwich turned out to be something else entirely, a starving grizzly cub, lost, desperate, and somehow drawn to him. What started as a quiet lunch would become a life-changing bond, one no one expected, and one that would melt even the coldest hearts. Ranger Daniel Hole had spent the last 3 weeks in Bear Gulch Station, one of the more remote outposts in Glacier National Park, the kind of place few tourists ventured and even fewer rangers requested. But Daniel preferred it that way. He wasn't hiding from the world, not exactly, but after the loss of his wife the previous year and the breakdown that followed, solitude felt like survival. That Tuesday was like most others, cold wind rustling through the pines, radio quiet except for an occasional weather update, and Daniel seated at his usual spot, a mossy old picnic table 200 yards from the ranger cabin. He unwrapped a ham sandwich, a thermos of coffee beside him, a notebook open, half full of wildlife tracking notes. He stared at it blankly, appetite gone. Then he heard a soft crunch behind him. He turned, expecting a squirrel, maybe a nosy jay. What he saw froze him, a bear cub, small, unsteady, its fur matted and thin in places, eyes too large for its head. It wasn't older than a few months, still round-faced and clumsy on its oversized paws, and it was staring directly at the sandwich. Instinct kicked in. Daniel didn't move, he knew better. Cubs usually meant a mother was near, and that spelled disaster if you got between them. But there was no huffing, no crashing through underbrush, just this trembling little thing, alone. It took another step, then another, and climbed awkwardly onto the bench across from him. Daniel blinked. The cub sniffed once, then snatched the sandwich in its teeth and dropped back down to the ground, chewing with urgency. He could have shouted, clapped, thrown his coffee, but he didn't, because as the cub devoured the meal, Daniel noticed something else. Its ribs, clearly visible through its dirty fur. This wasn't just a hungry animal, this was a starving one, and it was alone. Daniel rose slowly, stepped back, hands raised, a gesture to show he wasn't a threat. The cub flinched but didn't run. It finished the sandwich, licked the wrapper, then stared at him again. Its ears twitched. It didn't look afraid anymore, just tired. He whispered, "Where's your mom?" The cub didn't answer, of course, but something in its body, the way it sat down beside the table leg, too exhausted to flee, said everything. Daniel stood there in silence, heart pounding, not from fear but from something deeper, a stirring he hadn't felt in months. That night, he left a second sandwich out on the bench, and when he returned in the morning, it was gone, but so were his boots, dragged 10 feet into the woods and sitting in their place, a pinecone, as if the cub had offered a trade. Daniel laughed for the first time in a year, and in that laughter, something shifted. The cub came back the next morning. Daniel had just finished writing in his log when he heard it, the unmistakable crunch of small paws on morning frost. He turned, and there it was again, peeking out from behind a spruce, ears twitching and nose raised toward the scent of peanut butter. This time, Daniel didn't reach for his sandwich, he reached for a granola bar. He crouched and placed it gently on the ground a few feet from the picnic table, then backed away and sat, hands open on his knees. The cub hesitated, then padded forward, took it, ate the whole thing in 4 bites, and licked its paws when it was done. Over the next few days, this became a ritual. Daniel never tried to touch the cub. He didn't name it. He barely even spoke to it. But he started writing about it, not in the official logs, in a private journal, one he hadn't touched since his wife Leah passed. He described the cub's limp, subtle but present, the way its left paw turned slightly outward when it walked, the way it sniffed everything before committing, the way it seemed to tilt its head when Daniel spoke, like it was listening. He also wrote about the scar just behind the cub's right ear, barely visible beneath the scruffy fur was a jagged pink line. A sign of injury, maybe a trap, maybe a fight, maybe worse. It was clear now the cub was orphaned, and it wasn't going to survive the winter alone. That week, a storm moved in. Heavy snow fell over the mountains and temperatures dropped into the teens. Daniel stocked the woodpile, cleared the satellite antenna, and dug out his backup generator. On the second day, the cub didn't show up. Daniel waited. He left food on the bench, nothing. The third day, still no sign. By the fourth, he couldn't stand it. He strapped on his snowshoes, packed a thermos, and began to track. It wasn't hard to follow the cub's trail. Tiny paw prints, erratic and shallow, curved around the trees and led into a gully about half a mile from the cabin. Daniel's breath clouded in front of him, wind cut across his cheeks, and then he saw it, a pile of snow, disturbed, broken branches. The cub was there, barely visible in the white, curled up, unmoving. Daniel rushed forward and dropped to his knees. "Hey," he whispered, "come on, little thief. Not like this." He reached out carefully, not touching, just offering warmth. The cub blinked, slow, alive, but fading. Daniel did what no ranger was supposed to do. He took off his coat, wrapped the cub gently, and lifted it into his arms. It didn't fight, didn't growl, it just lay there, head pressed to his chest, breath shallow. By the time they got back to the cabin, Daniel's arms were shaking, from cold, from fear, from the weight of what he was choosing to do. He placed the cub by the stove, layered towels, warmed broth, and stayed up through the night, watching, waiting. And just before dawn, the cub sneezed. Daniel laughed out loud. It was the most beautiful sound he'd heard since Leah's voice. For the first time in weeks, the ranger cabin didn't feel so empty. The cub, now slowly recovering, lay curled in a makeshift bed near the wood stove, a pile of old fleece blankets and Daniel's thickest flannel shirt. He didn't know if it was the warmth, the food, or the steady crackling of the fire, but the little bear slept like it finally felt safe. Daniel didn't name it, he still refused, but he began calling it Scout in his journal. Scout had survived, but just barely. Daniel rationed his supplies to feed the cub, warmed goat's milk, soft oats, crushed berries from the emergency rations. He knew the protocol. He knew what he was doing was against every wildlife regulation he'd ever sworn to uphold. But this wasn't protocol anymore. This was survival. This was healing, for both of them. At night, Scout whimpered in his sleep. Sometimes his paws twitched like he was running. Sometimes he let out small, panicked moans. Daniel started leaving a glove in the blanket pile, one that smelled like him. Scout would curl up beside it, nose tucked under the cuff. Daniel didn't write about it in the ranger logs, but his personal journal filled up fast. Page after page, he wrote about how Scout would sit at the cabin window and watch the snow fall, head tilted like a curious child, how he tried to catch dust motes in the sunlight, how he once stole a sock and carried it around like a prized possession. He wrote too about Leah, about the silence her absence left behind, and how somehow that silence was now filled not with noise, but with presence. By the second week, Scout had gained weight. His fur looked thicker, healthier. His limp faded, and he began to move with the awkward confidence of a wild animal testing new strength. Daniel built a small enclosure just outside the cabin, reinforced and lined with logs and branches. During the day, Scout could roam in it, sniff the air, paw at the snow. Daniel would sit nearby, reading aloud from field guides. It became a routine, but it couldn't last. Daniel knew that. One morning, as he refilled the food dish, his radio crackled. Unit 12, we've got movement near Bear Gulch. Trail cam picked up large tracks, and what looks like a cub. Daniel froze. Scout looked up at him, chewing a pine cone. Copy, Daniel answered, voice steady. I'll check it out. He hung up the radio and leaned against the doorframe, breath slow, chest tight. They knew, or they were close to knowing. That night, he stood outside under the stars, Scout beside him in the snow. The cub nosed his boot, then curled against his leg, as if sensing the shift. Daniel reached down, hand resting on the bear's back. I don't know how this ends, he said quietly, but I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. Scout looked up at him, eyes bright, clear. And Daniel swore he understood. 3 days later, the knock came. It wasn't loud, just a sharp, purposeful rap against the cabin door. Enough to startle Daniel and send Scout scrambling under the table with surprising speed for a creature his size. Daniel opened the door, his heart already sinking. Standing on the porch was Ranger Kyle Mercer, clipboard in hand, parka zipped to the chin, and a look in his eyes that said he already knew too much. Morning, Kyle said. Daniel nodded, stepping aside. Kyle walked in, looked around, sniffed the air like a man who'd been in cabins like this his whole life. He didn't speak right away, just glanced at the wood stove, the table, the dish-drying rack, and the fresh claw marks near the door. Then he looked under the table. Scout didn't move. He just stared. Daniel braced himself. But Kyle didn't reach for his radio. Didn't step back. Instead, he crouched down slowly, resting on one knee, his voice low. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Scout let out a short grunt, not a growl, more curious than defensive. Kyle turned to Daniel. He's not afraid of me. Daniel shrugged. I didn't exactly train him to be. Kyle stood, rubbing the back of his neck. You know this is against every line in the book. I know. You could lose your job. I know. Kyle stared at the cub again. And I should report it. I know, Daniel repeated. The silence between them stretched long. Then Kyle surprised him. You know why I came out here, he asked. Wasn't the prince? Wasn't the trail cam? It was your wife. Daniel blinked. What? Kyle walked to the window, looking out into the snow. Leah was my field instructor when I was just starting. She once found a red fox caught in a poacher's wire. Everyone else wanted to euthanize it. She stayed up 3 nights to nurse it back to health. Let it go when it was strong again. He turned back. She'd have done the same thing you're doing now. Daniel sat down hard, emotion rising behind his eyes. Kyle walked to the door. I didn't see anything here, he said. But you've got to make a plan. Daniel looked up. A plan? He's growing fast. In a few months, he'll be too big to hide, and too used to humans to survive out there. So what do I do? Kyle hesitated. There's a sanctuary north of Bozeman. Private. Quiet. Not government-run. They sometimes take in unusual cases. You should reach out. He stepped outside and pulled the door halfway shut. I'll give you a week. And then he was gone. That night, Daniel sat on the floor beside Scout, who was curled near the stove again, chewing the last of the pine cones. He reached out and scratched gently behind one ear. "You always show up when people don't expect you." Scout looked up, blinked once, and laid his head on Daniel's boot. Daniel spent the next morning sitting on the porch, staring at the sky. Scout played nearby in the snow, rolling onto his back like a pup, batting at twigs and nipping playfully at a torn glove. He was bigger now. Stronger. The outline of the wild was starting to show in his shoulders, his paws, the way he moved. And still, he came when Daniel called. Still curled beside the stove when it got cold. Still looked at him like family. Daniel had called the sanctuary. Spoke with a woman named Ruth, who listened without judgment. She asked for photos. Daniel sent them. She called back 2 hours later. "We'll take him," she said. "No press. No cages. You can bring him yourself." Daniel thanked her, and then sat in silence for nearly an hour. He looked over at Scout, who was chewing on a pine cone, and his chest ached like someone was slowly pressing all the air out of it. He began preparing. That night, he reinforced the back of the parked truck with plywood and hay. He loaded food, blankets, a small rubber tire Scout liked to chew on. Scout watched it all with casual curiosity. Daniel avoided eye contact. Every time the cub looked at him with those big, innocent eyes, a part of him wanted to forget the call. To just stay. But Kyle's voice echoed in his head. "He'll be too big to hide soon." And Daniel knew this wasn't about fear. It was about love. The real kind. The kind that does what's best, even when it hurts. On the third day, everything was ready. Daniel walked Scout to the truck. The cub hopped into the back like it was an adventure, sniffing everything, nosing through the hay. Daniel smiled. "Of course you're not scared." The drive was long, 5 hours of winding roads and thick forests. Scout mostly slept, curled in the hay, rising only to nudge the thermos Daniel had left for warmth. When they arrived at the sanctuary gates, Ruth was already waiting. She was tall, middle-aged, with silver-streaked hair under a wool beanie, and eyes that missed nothing. "I've never seen a case like this," she said softly. As they opened the tailgate, Scout stepped down cautiously, nose twitching, then looked back at Daniel. Daniel dropped to one knee and held out his hand. The cub walked to him, rubbed against his chest, and let out a soft huff, a goodbye. Ruth let them have time. Daniel sat in the enclosure for over an hour. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Scout lay beside him, paw resting gently over his boot. And when the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel stood. He whispered, "You saved me too, you know." Then turned and walked away, tears hot in his eyes despite the cold. That night, he stayed at a roadside inn, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His phone buzzed once, a photo from Ruth, Scout curled in fresh hay, a stuffed sock beside him, looking peaceful. Beneath it was one word, safe. Daniel returned to Bear Gulch alone. The cabin felt different now, colder, even with the stove burning, quiet, even with the forest alive outside. He unpacked his gear in silence, placed Scout's old pine cone toy on the windowsill, and left the small bedroll beside the stove untouched. The blanket still held the shape of the cub's last sleep. At first, Daniel busied himself with work. He repaired trail signs, updated wildlife logs, and checked on old camera traps. He hiked more than usual, further than usual, maybe searching for distraction, maybe searching for pieces of something he didn't yet understand. But the ache didn't leave. Every morning, he caught himself looking toward the clearing, expecting to see the small scruffy shape trotting toward the table, tongue out, hungry and bold. He even made an extra sandwich, out of habit, out of hope. The forest, however, had other plans. Late one evening, Daniel returned from a long patrol. As he opened the door to the cabin, he noticed something odd on the porch, a pine cone, perfectly round, placed in the center of the step. He stared at it for a long time, his heart beating faster than it had in days. Coincidence? No. The next morning, he found claw marks near the creek. Small. Fresh. Couldn't be Scout, could it? He radioed the sanctuary. Ruth answered, "We had a breach in the fence last night," she said. "He's gone. We were going to call you." Daniel's knees went weak. "You think he's coming back here?" "I don't know," she said, "but animals like him, they remember where they were loved." For 2 days, Daniel waited. He checked the trails, left food out, watched the tree lean like a soldier on patrol. Nothing. Until the 3rd day. Just before dusk, he heard it, footsteps, soft, hesitant, but not small. He turned, heart in his throat. And there he was. Scout, taller, broader, fur thicker and eyes brighter, but still Scout. He stood at the edge of the clearing, nose high, tail twitching. Daniel stepped forward, breath caught. Scout didn't run. He trotted to the table, sat beside it, and waited. Daniel laughed through tears. "You little outlaw," he whispered. "You really came home." Scout didn't stay in the cabin that night. He curled in his old outdoor enclosure, breathing deep, head resting on his front paws. Daniel sat nearby in a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket, just watching. Neither said a word. They didn't have to. Some bonds didn't need explaining. Some goodbyes weren't forever. The next morning, Daniel radioed Ruth. "He's here," he said. She hesitated. "Do you want us to come get him?" Daniel looked out the window. Scout was rolling in the snow like he used to, tail flicking through the powder. Daniel smiled. Not yet. Winter melted into spring in Bear Gulch. The snow retreated from the hills, buds pushed through bark, and the cabin, once silent, once somber, was now filled with the quiet sounds of life. Scout never moved back into the sanctuary. Ruth called once more, kindly offering to send a team. Daniel declined. "He's home," he said. And somehow, everyone understood. Scout had changed. He no longer slept by the stove, but under the stars. He foraged on his own, climbed higher into the trees, and began exploring deeper into the woods. But he always came back. At first, it was every night. Then every couple of days. Eventually, just once a week. But each time, without fail, he left a pine cone on the steps, a quiet, consistent reminder. "I'm still here." Daniel changed too. He began volunteering with the wildlife rehab team in the region, training new rangers, sharing what he'd learned, not just about regulations and patrols, but about patience. About trust. About letting go when the time is right. He spoke about grief and about unexpected healing. Not once did he use Scout's name in the official meetings. But when others spoke of dangerous animals, of threats, of things they didn't understand, Daniel would quietly reach into his pocket and place a pine cone on the table. Then pause. And wait for the silence to teach what words couldn't. The last time Scout visited, it was late summer. He was massive now. His coat was thick and glistened in the sun, and his shoulders rippled with strength. He moved like the wild was fully his again. Yet, as he stepped into the clearing, there was no threat in him, only recognition. He didn't come to eat or play. He simply walked to the old picnic table, sat, and looked at Daniel, a long, steady gaze. Then he turned and walked back into the woods, without looking back. Daniel stood there a long time after he was gone. He didn't cry, not this time, because something in him knew Scout wasn't leaving him. He was simply living. And Daniel had helped him get there. That fall, the story leaked. Someone from the sanctuary shared it with a journalist. A ranger. A cub. A cabin. A heart that had been broken and mended by paws and pine cones. The story went viral. People from all over the world sent letters. Some angry. Some curious. But most, they sent thanks. And pine cones. Daniel kept the letters in a box by the fire. And every night, he'd add one pine cone to the bowl by the window. Just in case Scout came back. Because the truth was simple. In a moment of loneliness, a ranger saved a bear. But in the long silence after loss, that bear saved the ranger right back. If this story touched you, remember. Healing can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, the ones we try to save end up saving us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this with someone who believes in second chances, no matter how wild they seem.